Welcome to Cambridge Forum discussing stolen art with art security expert Anthony Amore in conversation with Conservator Ingrid Neuman.
I guess the thing I want to talk about is, as Pat alluded to, what makes looking for stolen art special. I think that everybody who has a specialty in terms of investigation sees their own field as special and different from all the rest. And that's a necessary part of being a successful investigator, I would say. You have to kind of be obsessed with your own little angle, your own little corner of the world. And I can't think of one that is smaller than mine. There's not many people who do what I do, that's the awkward way I was trying to get to this. When my background was being discussed by Pat, it was mentioned that I spent 15 years in agencies which are now thought of as Homeland Security agencies. I worked in immigration to start, the very unpopular agencies too, I should add. I started in immigration. After that, I was a special agent with the FAA. After 9/11, when the federal government took over aviation security responsibilities in the United States, I became the assistant director at Logan, changing security as we knew it at I guess what you would call the 9/11 airport, the airport where the two aircraft, from which the two aircraft departed and struck the Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan. So my whole career, in a nutshell, was focused on basically counterterrorism type positions, trying to keep people who meant harm to the United States, who meant to do some sort of terrorist attack or indiscriminate killing here in the United States from being successful. I did that for quite some time and felt it was very important work, but many of you in this room, most of you are old enough to remember what the climate was like in the United States after 9/11, what it was like on 9/12. And it was much different than it is now. Nobody was really complaining about aviation security along the lines. They understood why they were standing and waiting the way they were. I did that for a number of years, and once I got things the way I thought, I was happy with them. I moved around within the agency. So my first role with the TSA was overseeing the security screeners that were deployed. And I like to tell people, to give you an idea of the scope, one day I had no direct reports working for me, and then the next day I had 1,200 direct reports working for me, and that's the way this thing went. So it was stressful. And we oversaw, when we went from screening 0 checked bags in the United States to screening 100% of your checked bags. That was quite an undertaking. And then I went on to move to the inspections branch, where I oversaw inspections of security at the airport, investigations into security breaches at Logan. The reason I tell you this is because, first of all, when you work in that environment, which was, 17-hour days and constant threats coming your way, the concept, the idea of going to a place like the Gardner Museum every day instead is really enticing. I suspect many of you have been to the Gardner. You know how amazing the courtyard is at the Gardner Museum, and that's where the interviews are done for, at least for my position they were. And when you've worked basically in an airport environment for most of your career, then you have an interview in this courtyard. The biggest challenge is keeping an eye on the guy asking you the questions, because you can't believe your eyes. It's an amazing thing. So I decided to leave the government and take on this challenge at the Gardner. I knew its history. I knew what had happened there in 1990. But what I couldn't anticipate, and the reason I tell you this, tell you about my background, is because I could not anticipate the hold that looking for lost art and crimes against art has on me now. So I went over to this museum and I said, well, this is very important. It's incredibly important to protect this collection. Mrs. Gardner's legacy, I was swept away by it immediately. This is really something I want to be part of. But I didn't see it initially, between the time I accepted the job and when I stepped foot in the museum as the security director. I didn't see it as wow, this is as stressful or worrisome or captivating as terrorism in a post-9/11 environment. So on my first day, with my mandate to protect the collection and then try to fill these empty frames, I walked the museum, and I went up to the Dutch room where the big empty frames are. And again, I was totally obsessed with preventing terrorist acts in my prior career. And when I walked into the Dutch room, and I thought it was a new day for me, I thought I'd be a little bit more relaxed, and I considered these empty frames that once held Vermeer and Rembrandt. I said, oh no, here it comes again. This isn't just an ordinary job. This is not an ordinary investigation. And indeed, it's not. You probably know, and you probably often hear people refer to the theft at the Gardner as the biggest art heist in American history, one of the biggest art heists ever. That's a gross understatement. The theft at the Gardner is the biggest scale property theft in the history of man. Nothing has ever been stolen that's worth more than the art that was taken from the Gardner. But what's amazing about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is we don't look at those empty frames, we don't see dollar signs, we don't see this as, man, we lost a lot of valuable art in terms of dollars. And that's what people always want to know. How much is the art worth? What's the dollar value on this? It's not important. What's important is that Mrs. Gardner created this collective work of art. That's what the Gardner is. And she left it for the enjoyment and education of the public forever. That was her mandate. And as you might know, her will said nothing can ever be changed. It has to stay the way I left it. And to think that at least 2 thieves entered the museum one night in 1990 and took 13 pieces away from this collective work and left it less than whole is an abomination. It's an insult to all of us, not just the Gardner, not just the people of Boston or Massachusetts, but to the people of the world, that this incredibly selfish act could take place. I often say to people who ask me about my job, whether they be board members at the Gardner or police officers or audiences, what does this type of work mean to you? They ask me these questions, and I say, when I came to the Gardner from a law enforcement background, I thought that, I'll be working at a museum, an esteemed museum. I'm going to be rubbing elbows with art experts and upper crust of society at the museum. Instead, I spend most of my time talking to criminals and people who have stolen things in the past, or someone who might have killed somebody who knew something about, you name it. So you don't deal with the people. I don't get to deal with Ingrid or people like Ingrid as much as I'd like to. So there's an element of danger involved in looking for stolen art. There's a reason nobody has come forward with our paintings, and it's not because they expect to be greeted with flowers in the $5 million reward that we offer. There's an element of danger to it, and I think back to our museum director, Ann Hawley, one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. And I was talking to her about this group of miscreants that I was dealing with, and she stopped and said, Anthony, these paintings are not worth your life. You have to be careful here. And the thing I want to get across to you about looking for stolen art is what I said to her. And that is, the paintings are worth more than my life. Think about them. Because I can promise everybody in this room one thing, and that I'm going to die someday. There's no avoiding it. But these masterworks are supposed to live on forever. Rembrandt painted the Storm of the Sea of Galilee in 1633. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, it stayed in good condition. In the Netherlands, came to America, and it's supposed to be there for my children, their children, and so on. Right now, it's not there. What's important is that we get it back. These things are supposed to live on forever. So I hope I'm expressing to you the idea that I think sometimes people look at stolen art or art theft as something glamorous or exciting or mysterious and fodder for outstanding books like stealing Rembrandts. But it's much more important to that. It says so much about who we are as a people. It's an example of the greatest that our brethren can create. It's greatness. It's the documented history of a long-gone era when you talk about these old Dutch works. So I thank you for coming out tonight, and I'm looking forward to the questions that Ingrid and that you might have, but I hope that all made sense to you. Thank you.
Okay. I also did a stint at the Gardner Museum in 1987, I think. As an intern, I got to wash the mosaic in the atrium area. It was one of the highlights of my life so far. Okay, so I'm a conservator, so I'm very detail-oriented, so I've prepared my remarks for this portion of the program, so I hope you'll bear with me. Don't want to miss any details. As a professionally trained conservator, I preserve three-dimensional sculpture, in particular, composed of a wide variety of materials. I'm trained to understand both the physical and the chemical methods of deterioration that art materials can undergo throughout time. My charge is to attempt to preserve a work of art using materials which have been vetted by scientists to last approximately 100 years. That's the state of the art right now. In this way, we can ensure that the art will survive for several more generations until future art conservators will eventually invent more sophisticated means to preserve the same art that we are stabilizing today. Conservators, such as myself, were really temporary custodians of the works of art, and I'm merely a blip on the lifeline of that work of art, and I think Anthony alluded to that a little bit. Pat asked me to talk a little bit about my life, how it's been touched by art, so I want to continue along that vein. Although we seem like we live in a throwaway kind of culture, most people would agree that visual art is something to preserve as a marker of culture, to document changing cultures, values, and viewpoints. I see art in part as a form of documentation. Art becomes special or valuable or even unique, especially when it has been made with materials or technology that no longer exists. Consider a Polynesian cape made out of bird feathers, which is now, the bird is extinct now at this point, or sculptures made out of elephant ivory, a material that can no longer be legally imported into this country. By working directly with art, I am able to study the hand that makes the art and learn about the artist's working methods. Having the opportunity to study the artistic processes, including the use of specific tools and technology, as well as the materials, including pigments, patinas, glazes, enables me to become closer to the artist, even if she or he is no longer alive. This is a unique opportunity which I value every day. There are a myriad of ways to decipher how an artist worked during his or her lifetime. A conservator can examine a work of art using a microscope or using different wavelengths of light, for example. Scientific instrumentation has vastly improved since the early 20th century, when conservation science was formulated as a discipline in this country. Examining a work of art under magnification can lead to fascinating discoveries such as a brush hair or a shaky hand. Using different light sources such as infrared or ultraviolet can reveal underdrawings or changes in the artistic composition, originally not observable to the naked eye. These scientific techniques actually allow a conservator to get closer to the artist and their art process. And often, the original appearance of an artwork can be, more fully understood. This new information can then be utilized by scholars, curators, collectors, and even artists themselves today. Unfortunately, not all art is of equal quality. That's what I've learned. Ancient art, which has been passed down to us, is, generally speaking, is in very good quality because it was created in a sort of a formulaic way, a tried and true way, and that is why it has survived. It's almost like a kind of natural selection of art. Conversely, ancient artworks which were of an experimental nature or composed of materials not mixed in the correct proportions, for instance, that did often happen with ancient glass, has not survived in many cases. As a conservator, I regularly examine works of art to determine their stability for exhibition and loan purposes. There's been a long history of art restoration throughout the world, with which I'm sure you're very familiar, even before there was art conservation, which is more of a new discipline. In many cases, current art conservators spent much of their time improving the past campaigns of earlier restorers, who unfortunately, they didn't have access to the kinds of materials that we have today, and so they used materials which did not age very well. And I'm sure you're familiar with, you've probably seen a painting and you've looked in the sky area and there might be this really dark spot and you think it's a cloud, but it looks like discolored paint. And that's just because the earlier restorer didn't have proper materials to use to make the proper, well, it probably matched at one time, but age has unfortunately not been good to it, and it's discolored over time. There's a wide variety of quality in the art being produced today. Some contemporary art, for example, is composed of the here and now. It is composed really for the here and now only, and is considered ephemeral in nature. What I mean is that this particular contemporary art is really intended to slowly fade or erode away over time, evolve into a different state of being. These artworks are especially challenging for conservators to preserve in the long term. Consider the contemporary artist Janine Antoni, creating sculptures of chocolate or soap, for instance, that really aren't made to, last forever. A blatant contrast to an Egyptian mummy, which was intentionally prepared to last for eternity. Conceptual artists such as Saul LeWitt offer certificates for temporary recreation of their work of art or design for a limited period of time. Additionally, many contemporary sculptors include components made out of some form of plastic material, and many of these plastics are not stable for the long term. In this way, much of the art being produced today is very precious in that it will not last as long as some of the art from antiquity. Despite it being new, contemporary art is especially challenging to preserve, whether it be due to the design and intent of the artist or to the ephemeral nature of the material selected by the artist. So traditionally, much of the conservator's time is spent caring for a work of art, examining it, documenting it using photographic processes, treating the art, perhaps cleaning the surface, removing dirt, or even removing a discolored protective layer of varnish. However, much of the care of contemporary art these days revolves around the thorough documentation of an artist's working methods and personal philosophy towards the preservation of their own art. This is accomplished by interviewing artists and discussing how they envision their art aging over time. Meeting artists to discuss their preservation philosophies is a fairly new and definitely exciting aspect in the field of conservation today. I am personally particularly intrigued when an artist chooses to push the envelope and experiment with art materials and combination of materials in new ways. I would venture to say that understanding how the art is made is just as important to me as a conservator as the visual impact of the art itself. I think it's fair to say that conservators, for instance, are interpreters of the physicality of the art. As a segue into our discussion tonight, I would like to stress that art is affected by aging, just like everything else around us, including ourselves. Conservators attempt to slow down the aging process by practicing what we call preventive conservation, which is when we attempt to control the environmental conditions to which art is subjected. When a museum acquires a work of art, it is placed in a very consistent environment with a prescribed and regulated temperature and relative humidity. In this way, museums are attempting to slow down the aging process by reducing the agents of deterioration, such as light intensity, ultraviolet, as well as reducing encounters with pollutants and erratic temperatures and relative humidity. Without these precautions, material decay will hasten. So relevant examples that you've probably noticed are, oil paintings on linen or panels, oil on panel, oil on linen, where you might observe some cracks or things like that from fluctuations in relative humidity. You might see some warping of wood or cockling of paper, we call it, where it ripples due to excessive moisture content. Mold is often, a very scary phenomenon in a museum. If we have elevated levels of relative humidity, you get staining from mold, which can be permanent. So light, in particular, is tremendously damaging to any work of art. It can fade the art. It can bleach certain fugitive pigments or unstable pigments over time. Excessive light can also darken certain types of paper. The paper becomes very difficult images on the paper become very difficult to see because the paper darkens and it becomes very brittle, and then it breaks and flakes. Both the intensity of the light and the ultraviolet component of light are very dangerous culprits of damage to art. So regarding tonight's topic of stolen art, when art is removed and stolen from a museum, it leaves a well-controlled environment in terms of relative humidity and temperature, as well as light control. It enters an exterior environment that is wrought with fluctuations. It is precisely the quality and quantity of these fluctuations which can accelerate the deterioration of art. In the museum, we strive to keep a consistent temperature and relative humidity, and if there are fluctuations, we like to make them as gradual as possible. Not all art benefits from the same environmental conditions, however. We have more stringent guidelines for the type of light, intensity, duration, for organic materials, for instance, like wood, anything that was once living, wood, ivory, bone, paper, anything made of cellulose, linen. So those kinds of materials require, say, 40 to 50% relative humidity. So we have these very strict guidelines. For metals, such as bronze, we have different guidelines because metals are inorganic and they can potentially suffer from corrosion. The preferred relative humidity guideline is ideally 30 to 40%. So you can see it really depends. We custom design environments for these works of art. In addition to our concern about relative humidity, temperature, and light, we're also concerned about pests, such as insects, and even humans. Human beings are grouped into the category of pests. Human beings can mishandle works of art by being oblivious to the fragility, say, of an oil painting as a composite, interrelated composition of resins, pigments, glues, cloth, metal, and wood. Untrained handlers of art thieves in this case, would not have the acquired knowledge, or know-how, how to best preserve the surface of art from abrasions or the structure of the art, from cracking and warping. So in closing, I'd just like to say many types of damage can be repaired. That's the good news. They can be repaired and made to look whole again by a qualified art conservator. However, it truly depends on the extent to which the artwork has been exposed to these fluctuations and intensities of the relative humidity, temperature, light, pests that I've talked about. The bad news is that once an artwork has been damaged, it is forever compromised. For more information on the care of works of art, you should consult the website for our national organization, which is called the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. So with that, that's a little background, and we can start our conversation. So I have the honor and privilege of asking the first question. So I enjoyed reading your book very much.
Thank you.
I read it recently, and although I did hear you at the Coolidge Corner Paperback Booksmith when it first came out.
Oh, thanks for coming.
And so it was quite riveting reading, and of course I have many, many questions, but I'm not going to take up all of the time, but I was just wondering a couple of things. In a perfect art world, world of art, what role do you think the media would ideally play in the recovery of stolen artworks? Do they typically hinder or help the process, in your opinion?
That's a great question. It depends on when the theft took place. And I say that because, the Gardner investigation is going on 24 years in just a few weeks. And the media has been very good to us in some respects. I could say for instance, the Boston Herald really went out of their way to try to help us. They set up a microsite on their website. They even went as far as to, I remember they had one issue, a Sunday issue, where it said on the front page, "Let's help the Gardner." I mean, what more can you ask for? But there have been articles that have been written that are incredibly detrimental to the investigation. There was I remember a year ago, some of you might remember, we did a press conference about information that we had uncovered, and a reporter in Boston wrote a column in so many words saying that we were lying, which still baffles me that we would lie in a press conference like that. But I would point to an art theft that happened about 3 weeks after my book came out to talk about how the press can help. So stealing Rembrandts, Tom and I catalog 81 thefts of Rembrandts over the last 100 years. That was the impetus of the book, and talked about what we learned from them. And as fate would have it, about 3 weeks after the book came out, another Rembrandt was stolen. So it was the 82nd. And the media, this was in Los Angeles. It was a drawing purported to be by Rembrandt called The Judgment, and it was taken in Marina del Rey. And the media in Los Angeles called me a lot because I had a book called Stealing Rembrandts, and one had been stolen. And just before I started answering their questions and doing interviews with them, I was in contact with the public information officer for the LA County Sheriff's Department, which was the investigating agency. And this individual, his name is Captain Mike Parker, and he is a genius when it comes to social media. And what he did was take this image and the story of when it was stolen and blasted it to every outlet you can imagine, so that within something like 18 hours, there were over 300,000 hits for this image on Google. He made this piece of work too recognizable to sell. After he told me this, I coordinated with him and told him what my plan was. Whenever I spoke to the television or the newspapers in LA, I gave a message to the thieves, and that was, you've not stolen a picture, you've stolen a problem. Give it back and hope this whole thing goes away. And 36 hours later, the drawing was left in a church in Marina del Rey, and the picture was recovered, and so far everybody's lived happily ever after. But I think that's what the media, and when I say the media now, I'm talking about citizen journalists and blogs and social media networks hold a great promise for art when it's stolen. Now, the caveat I'd give to this and any other question is I'm really speaking about masterworks. It becomes much more difficult when you're talking about a lesser-known artist in a lesser-known piece that's taken from a gallery as opposed to a big theft in a museum. So I'm really talking about masterpieces here, but I think that's what the future holds.
So the goal is really to obtain the artwork and not to it's secondary if you're able to prosecute.
Exactly, and that's what puts me in a unique position. I spend my time alongside FBI agents that help on this case. They're working on the case. Brilliant guys, totally dedicated to finding the art. Don't care about the glory, just want to see these paintings recovered. All of you that have seen images of these pieces or have seen them in real life know that they transcend anything other than wanting to see them put back where they belong. But my position is unique in that I'm looking for these pieces in the same way, except I couldn't care less about prosecutions or arrests. Couldn't care less. I have one agenda, and that is to get the paintings back, put them back in the frames, and then let skilled people like Ingrid work on the paintings and the objects that were stolen.
Right. So it is very different, in fact, from
Completely
recovering
different.
anything. And if I can ask one more question, what is your philosophy on training of museum guards to safeguard museum collections? Because you do allude to, in your book, a few places have armed guards, very unusual. What is your philosophy on all of that?
My philosophy when training the guards or bringing guards on is similar to any experience I've had in the past in working with security people, and that is you have to get across to them that security is a thankless job. If you're taking this job because you expect people to walk up to you every day and pat you on the back and say, "Thank you for being here," it's the wrong line of work. You have to have self-fulfillment. People only contact me about guards when they have a complaint. Okay, and one of the challenges for a museum security director is to say, okay, I got one complaint this month, but there were 30,000 people who passed through the doors. I'm pretty certain that it was probably the person and not the guard. But, we take it all seriously. But what you have to do is get across to museum guards that, it's a monotonous job, there's no question about it. But first of all, it's an honor to be in this room with this stuff all day. You're not looking at a television monitor or a parking garage. You're looking at Rembrandt or Titian or Van Dyck or Velázquez. It's a pretty good place to be. And I also explain to them, your duties throughout the day are very few, but if you have to intervene, you could be the difference between a piece of art surviving or, in a good situation, it being off the wall for a few years while it's being repaired. So if you explain the gravity of what they're trying to do, hopefully that'll counter the monotony of what they do on a daily basis.
Well, should we open up the
Sure, I'm
floor
always
to
welcome to
questions, probably? Would anyone like to come forward and ask Anthony a question?
Very interesting. Pat, in her introduction, mentioned $6 billion of value of stolen art. I don't know what period of time that covered, but perhaps you could put into perspective how you come up with that kind of a number and where all this comes from. I'm sure it doesn't come out of the garden. I'm not sure whether the garden's had anything stolen since '90.
No.
So that's a lot of art coming from various places. And maybe you could just give us a little thumbnail of how that all gets accumulated.
I'd be happy to. So, it's an estimate that $6 to $8 billion a year, that's a yearly basis, of art is involved in crime. I know it's kind of a weird way to say it, but that includes art that is stolen, art that is trafficked, so it's traded, it's used in the drug trade, it's used as collateral, it involves art that is created through forgeries, it involves antiquities that are art that are looted and trafficked around the world. The FBI has said this number about $6 to $8 billion, and that puts it just after guns and drugs in terms of international trafficking. It's a colossal problem, and for every time you hear about a Picasso being stolen, you're constantly reading. If you're in my line of work, you're constantly reading about a theft here and a theft there on a weekly basis. Of somebody breaks into a gallery in a place like Newbury Street and steals 20 prints by Erte, valuable lesser work by Moreau, and what have you. And this stuff happens constantly. Art is stolen from places you might not think of. More than half of all art that's stolen in the United States is stolen out of people's homes. It's really a big problem. If you have valuable art in your home, you really should think about who you let into your house, who your contractors are, who knows what you have? People like to show art because they want to show it off, and that's a noble thing. You want to share it with other people. But, you know, one day you might be walking your electrician upstairs to the attic, and you stop and say, oh, this is a drawing by Picasso that my grandmother left for me. And that electrician may be taking special note of what you have in your house. I don't mean any disrespect to electricians. I picked that out of the air. But then, you know, you have art stolen from museums, of course, lots of art stolen from galleries, stolen from universities, stolen from libraries. You'd be amazed the art collections that some libraries here in Massachusetts have. It's unbelievable. But they're strapped for cash, and they don't have the resources to say, we're going to put museum-quality security behind this painting that was donated to us by one of our town fathers. That turns out to be worth $6 million. It happens constantly. If you, like I do, if you set up a Google alert for a stolen painting, stolen sculpture, art theft, you're going to be getting alerts 3 or 4 times a week. And that's just what's reported. It's vastly underreported because people, if you have a small museum and you lose a small piece, you don't want potential donors to know you lost a piece of art. It might inhibit people from giving in the future. So it goes underreported. So it is a serious, serious problem. And unfortunately, a lot of times, institutions don't put enough resources to protect their art until something bad happens. So I hope any of you who have art at home go home tonight and look at it and say, am I doing right by this piece that's in my house?
Do you want to mention the art loss registry, though, while you're at it?
Well, there are, you know, I'm glad you pointed out, there are a number of databases that exist that catalog the world's lost art. All of them are hardly representative of the massive amount of art that's missing. I use Interpol's stolen art database, enormous. When I go through it to look for a particular artist because I'm interested in if a certain piece was stolen, every single time I'm just floored by how much is in there. I mean, if I'm able to go in and narrow it down to a certain artist, and then it shows all the pieces by that person that are missing, you just can't believe your eyes. The Art Loss Register also has a database, and if you own art, you can register it with them, or if it's a piece of your art is stolen, you can contact them and put it in their registry in case it comes up at an auction. But that's a for-profit organization. And there's a lot of controversy about the ethics involving the Art Loss Register. I'm not passing judgment. I don't want to seem like I'm for it or against it in any way. But if you read New York Times recent articles about the Art Loss Register, there's controversy that exists. One of their members of their leadership team recently left to form his own group because he thought he could do it in a better way. But you know, there are other databases out there. I myself have a database of, not of the pieces, but of the crimes, because I like to look at the MO of who steals art. And I have about 1,300 different art thefts in this database. And I break it down by, you know, did they cut the paintings out of frames? Did they leave the frames behind? Did they use a gun? Did they wear a mask? Was there violence? How many guys were involved? Or women. Of course, it's always men now. Is there a reward? If there was it paid? How many pieces taken at a time? What was the venue? What was the time of day? How did they get in? Did they disable the alarm? I'm droning on and on, I know, but that's the sort of thing you need to catalog if you want to have a good idea of who does this and why they do it and what becomes of art. And that question I just asked was the impetus for writing Stealing Rembrandts, to try to determine, all right, who really does this? You know, I had to go from terrorism world to art theft. I wanted to see, okay, well, who am I looking for here? And what I knew is what you know, and that's what I saw in movies. I saw the Thomas Crown Affair, and I saw Entrapment with Sean Connery and Catherine Zeta-Jones, and what I saw in those movies is the polar opposite of what really happens in life. There's no Pierce Brosnan figures out there stealing this art. There's no Dr. No, who is this secret evil billionaire who has guys go out and steal this art for him so that he can put it in his underground lair and get his brandy sniffer and his smoking jacket and look at it and say, it's just mine. It doesn't happen in the real world. But I can't tell you how many people I speak to in lectures like this, and then afterwards they come up to me and say, so do you think a billionaire has it in his basement? No, he doesn't. These things are stolen by common criminals. There are very, very few people, you can count them on one hand, who are professional art thieves. And I can only call them that because they've done it more than once. The vast majority of your art thieves have stolen art one time. And the reason they don't do it again is because they find you can't make money stealing and trying to sell art. It's too recognizable and it's too valuable. And they see their folly and they take the painting and they hide it under their friend's mother's bed on Hanover Street in the North End. And if that sounds like an extreme example, I'll tell you that a painting by Rembrandt, which was thought to be a portrait of Elizabeth Van Ryn, his sister, was stolen from the MFA in 1975 and for years hidden under someone's bed in the North End of Boston. Now, everybody believed I'll bet you it was a Japanese industrialist, and it's in his home, and he has all these paintings he's hiding from the world. No, it was above a restaurant in the North End. So that's why I wrote the book. I want people to really understand who steals this stuff. It's not Thomas Crown. It's a Coen Brothers film. It's bizarre stories of often bumbling crooks, but they make off with this stuff and they don't know what to do with it. And that's a tragedy.
In your book, you also seem to mention more than once that the art is often discovered fairly close proximity to the area from which it was stolen.
Yep.
Is that
That's
correct?
true, especially of the United States. There was a study I read that I love from a great group called the International Foundation for Art Research, IFAR. They're in New York. It's just a handful of women who work there out of love for art. And they've cataloged art theft, and they know more than any of the groups I mentioned before. They're amazing. And studies have shown that when a painting is stolen, or a sculpture or an object is stolen in the United States, that piece stays in the United States. It doesn't go abroad. When a piece is stolen in Europe, for instance, it can come to the United States. So it's a weird dynamic there. And the reason for that is because of border issues. So let's suppose I steal a painting in Los Angeles and I want to sell. I can sell it across the United States, drive it to New York, and if I follow speed guidelines and don't get in an accident, no one's ever going to know I transported it across I don't know how many states' borders. If I steal a painting in Ireland and I want to move it the same distance, I'm going to have to cross customs over and over and over. So for a painting stolen in Britain, what's the difference flying it to the United States or taking it to Italy? But in the U.S., you don't have to go abroad to move a piece or try to move a piece. You can move with free will. So my firm belief is that when art is stolen in the United States, you're going to find it in a pretty tight radius from where it was stolen.
Are there other questions from the audience?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple of questions. The original question I was going to ask was, what does the art theft and art crime industry look like? But you just answered that to a large degree. I used to read occasionally in newspapers that the main way that art thieves recovered, some return on the enterprise, should we call it, was through approaching insurance companies. And the impression I came away with was, this would require some sophistication and professional expertise to do without landing up in jail. So I wondered, are the people who are doing that these same kind of common criminals who don't know what they're doing? Or are they a subset of art thieves who, actually are more effective?
In terms of insurance, I think that's the impetus for a number of art thefts. That is one of the motives that you have to consider, that maybe the thieves took it hoping that they'll get paid off by an insurance company to return it. That's certainly one of the motives. I think that it does. I don't know if it points to any type of sophistication. In fact, it's not uncommon for a museum to have not insured every piece that's on its walls at any one time. In many respects, that's cost prohibitive to take a museum and say we're going to put insurance on pieces that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It's no secret that the Gardner art was not insured. So the next day, I think it was 1 day or 2 days after the heist, the Boston Globe reported and the Herald reported that Mrs. Gardner's paintings were not insured. And, people are often surprised by that, but, you can make an argument that insuring them becomes a motive. The other thing you can think about is Mrs. Gardner's will said that the art couldn't be replaced, so there was no point in having insurance money to buy another painting and put it in its place. I won't mention the museum, but there's a well-known museum in North America that was robbed of an enormous amount of art decades ago. And they got their insurance money, and they bought another painting with it, hoping to move on. And that painting turned out to be misattributed, and they just want the whole thing to go away. They're not even looking for their stolen paintings anymore. So there's a lot of different ways this can happen, but one of the great motives in art theft is to take something and use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. So a criminal gang, and I'm not talking about the mafia, I'm talking about these gangs of crooks that work together and do everything from rob banks to armored cars to pharmacies for OxyContin to you name it. They know their work, their 9 to 5, 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. is crime. And they know, they often get arrested. And it's nice to have a stolen painting to say, if I get arrested, I can tell the police I have a bargaining chip. And maybe if this thing goes away, I can give you back this painting and everyone lives happily ever after. That's happened many times in the past. Another motive is to use the art as collateral. So, for instance, just one scenario would be, there's a drug trade, a very valuable drug trade, and, I'm going to give money to someone for the art. Well, maybe I'll give them a certain amount of money. I'm going to give them money for drugs. Well, I always wondered to myself before I was involved in this, well, who goes first? Who trusts the other drug dealer with their millions of dollars worth of product or cash? One drug dealer might say, here's X amount of dollars in a stolen Cezanne, and then I get the drugs, and then I send the rest of the cash, that sort of thing. So it's used as currency in that respect. And there's other scenarios how it's used in the drug trade too, but ideally, people would know that you can't make money on this stuff and that it's a mistake to steal it, but people continue to steal art. They know it's valuable. They figure, boy, I can move this. Right? I can guarantee you, unfortunately, there are not many criminals who did what Ingrid did and went to the library and took out stealing Rembrandts and said, let me research what becomes of stolen art. Instead, they say, boy, this stuff's valuable. I know I can move it. Pennies on the dollar, it's worth $1 million. I'll get $100,000 for this thing. Right? And then they look at a museum, and what's the purpose of a museum? It's accessibility. The whole point is to put the world's greatest treasures out there for others to enjoy. Right? It's not like a jewelry store. That's okay. Can you hear me? It's not like a jewelry store where you put diamonds or gems behind thick glass, bulletproof glass, and you have armed guards standing over your shoulder, and you make it really tough to get in and out of, and you have to be buzzed in and buzzed out. And it's not like a bank where you expect to be, there's a vault and everything's hidden from you. The whole point of a museum is that all of us in this room can go in and get this close to a painting by one of the world's great artists, to see the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. So the challenge in terms of security is huge, right? I can't go to the Gardner tomorrow and say, change your policy, boys. I want AK-47s in the Dutch room, and I want a SWAT team in the Gothic room, and I'll not yell now, and that's how we'll proceed. And we're going to put, how many of you have seen the Mona Lisa? And you don't have to raise your hands to this question, but I know my children, what they answered, frankly, they were disappointed. They went and they saw the Mona Lisa, and it's behind glass, and they're so far from it, it seems so small. You get the same, some of the same feeling when you see La Pietà at the Vatican, at the cathedral. Boy, it's so beautiful. Why can't I get closer to it? Right? Michelangelo intended for you to be able to get close to it. Da Vinci wanted you to see this painting up close, but you can't because there's bad people out there and they do bad things to this stuff, so you have to put separation. At the Gardner, we don't even have the whistles. When you get too close to something, it makes that little whistle sound at a lot of museums. Because Mrs. Gardner wanted this to be an intimate experience. She didn't even want labels. She wanted you to go in and see this stuff and enjoy it for what it is. And that's the challenge for security. And it's that accessibility, but that's what makes it enticing for thieves. I can yank this off the wall and run out. This database I mentioned to you that I have 1,300 some odd art thefts in it. One of the things I found is that more than half of these 1,300 were committed in broad daylight. Thieves go into museums when the place is open. The three major art thefts in Massachusetts in history were the Worcester Art Museum in '72, the MFA in '75, and the Gardner in 1990. The first two I mentioned happened in broad daylight. Two thieves walk in, take the paintings they want off the wall, take out their guns, and run out. So, it's an open environment, and it's enticing for bad guys.
I should say, in all fairness to museums, there is there's security hardware that a lot of museums use, although some museums don't, to try to keep the art better attached to the walls.
No question. And I would want to, thank you so much, Ingrid. I should say that the second part of that is that challenge is met by museums. So what you do is you set up layers of security. It's not just the hardware that keeps the painting on the wall. It's what you have to do to get to that painting, how far it is from the door, guards, cameras, motion detectors, other types of sensors. So you just pile these things on. I would tell you that I have no problem saying this to the world. I'm very proud of the security at the Gardner. Well, I could tell you, first of all, I am not a lucky person. I haven't encountered luck yet in looking for stolen art. It's all cataloging and doing the first thing I told you. That was the first mission. And I'm using the Gardner as an example, but there were other art thefts that I've been involved in. You go back on an old theft like this and you say, give me every single letter we ever received, every phone message, every name that's ever come up, every newspaper article, and I took all of that information in another database and cataloged it. I have upwards of 30,000 different bits of information on this theft, and that's what I would do for any theft. And look at all the knowns. There's a reason patterns emerge when you talk about crime. Terrorism or crime, there's patterns that you can find. I would look in the immediate area, and what I would do, the first thing is examine the MO. How exactly did they go about this? Thieves don't like to deviate from the way they've acted in the past because they're looking for the path of least resistance. They're looking for a sure bet. Criminals do not look for challenges. In the movies they do. George Clooney and Brad Pitt do in the Ocean's 11 through 13 movies. But they don't in real life. They're not looking to get caught. They're looking to get away. So I would look exactly at how it was performed. I would walk through the crime myself. I would do everything to get inside the head of the thief that committed the crime. And then, once I had all the information I could possibly gather, I would gather more by going out and talking to bad guys, talking to criminals, not just people who've done things with art before. In fact, a lot of times they're the least useful. But frankly, going to the most experienced criminals that I can find and talk to them about the way this happened and what are you hearing? What's the word out there? You know, what comes to mind? And explain the crime to them and say, you know, based on what I just told you, what does that tell you? What names come to mind? And oftentimes they're very willing to talk to me. You know, one of my advantages is that I'm looking for art. You know, I'm not going out and I'm not looking to prosecute people. And a lot of times there's a reward involved. So it's all information gathering, but you have to have the stomach for dealing with people quite unlike yourselves in this room tonight. I wish that I was dealing with people like you, but that's not who steals art.
It is controversial to offer a reward, isn't it? There's two minds about that. And so what thought processes went into determining first how much to offer and if you should offer a reward at all? Because it's a double-edged sword.
Rewards are controversial. There's a difference between a reward and a ransom, though. For instance, I would recommend a reward in my own ethics in terms of art recovery would be a reward would go for information leading to the recovery, but the reward cannot go to the people who perpetrated the crime. That's where it becomes a ransom. One of my mentors in this field, an incredible former Scotland Yard detective who just goes by the name Rocky, an amazing guy. He recovered the stolen Turner paintings that were stolen from the Tate Gallery back in the early 2000s. And the way those payments went out, still to this day, people are debating whether that was a ransom or a reward. I can tell you that the Gardner's reward is a reward, and it's offered by the museum, not by the government. And it's the largest private reward ever offered for anything. And we have that same caveat. That reward will not go to the people who stole the paintings. So that's that fine line. I am a big proponent of the reward because you can sit around and have a philosophical debate about it, but if you want your paintings back and you want me to get information from people and you want me to get it quickly, there's got to be an incentive. And the reward is usually the best one. But I will tell you that I'm often surprised when I speak to reformed criminals, ex-cons, who are trying to make an honest life for themselves, how much they see, how much redemption they see in helping me with these paintings. Believe it or not, there is that little light at the end of the tunnel where they do want to help for the sake of the art, where they say, I want to be part of this. I want to help you get these things back. And now I haven't gotten them back yet. So who knows how they're going to turn once they go in the frames. But that's a heartening and valuable advance in the investigation.
I have two quick questions. The first one is, I'd like to know, or what is the percentage of recovered compared, what would you say of of course it expand too many years to judge, but let's say in a 10-year span, about what percentage of the art would you think is recovered by experts and people that do it? And the second question I have is just a curiosity. I'm assuming because there's so much more hanging art or picture art that would be the greatest item that is stolen, but I wondered about jewelry, and many of the museums have furniture, if that is ever stolen, statuary, and metal objects and things like that. Mm-hmm. Is there much of that type of art also?
In reverse order, I would say paintings by far. There's lots of jewels stolen, but in terms of jewels that are displayed as art, it's very, very rare compared to paintings. Furniture, incredibly rare. Statuary, not as rare at all. So that happens quite often. But it's paintings, and not just paintings, but like seriographs and lithographs and... Thank you. That's so much, you know, honestly, I'm not just saying this because Ingrid's here. Conservators are the best people in museums. Nothing comes close to conservators. They know everything. They're the best resource for people who do what I do too, by far. Works on paper.
Probably not fabric.
Like tapestries?
Yes.
Happens, but rarely. Painting, you know, again, it's because criminals don't go about this from an educated perspective. They think paintings, famous artist, valuable, let's steal it.
Okay.
What was the first part again?
The first question was, what would be your guesstimate, I guess?
Oh, recovery
Of how
rates?
much is really recovered of the fine art that is stolen?
There's no reliable statistics so that I can give you a metric, but I would say that masterpieces are recovered much more frequently than, I'm trying to think of a better term than lower level art. What is a better term? There's no such thing. It's, what was that?
Lesser known.
Oh, that was perfect. Whoever threw out lesser known, thank you. Lesser known pieces are have a much lower recovery rate. And I would say this about recovery too, that in relation to masterpieces, what people consider masterpieces, they're either recovered right away, soon after the theft, or a generation later. They disappear for a generation. And that's because a lot of times the baddest of the bad guys has either died or incapacitated, or people are not as afraid of him anymore. So an ex-wife comes forward, an ex-girlfriend, a disgruntled prodigal child, they come forward and say, I have to tell you what happened. So that's how the recoveries usually happen.
Hi. I'm starting from somewhat of a deficit because I haven't read your book, but it's a very interesting topic. And I guess I have a question, but I'll first start with the whole notion of stolen art seems like it goes back so far, because, I mean, museums have stolen art. And so that's just an interesting concept, because the demographic that you're talking about is really interesting, because it sounds like you've kind of like pretty much pinpointed the criminal and as a certain type, and that's much more of a contemporary thing, it sounds like. Maybe, I mean, you look very young to me, so.
Well, thank you.
So I was interested, so the question that comes out of what I'm saying is, what is the demographic? You say, like, the stolen art, that the people are not that smart, that they're stealing art, and they also will steal OxyContin or whatever they can steal. But it seems like this is very hard to make any money off of. But with a reward, it seems like that would be a real significant way to make money for somebody who wants to steal art. But I guess it's not often that rewards are given or not.
Well, for the first part, I would say my own studies in terms of the sorts of people who steal art go back to the oldest theft that I have in my personal database. The book, I went back 100 years.
Okay.
And my own database coincidentally goes back 100 years, but it's not Rembrandt. I start basically with the theft of the Mona Lisa in 1911.
Okay.
It's a pretty steady description in terms of biodata on the people who do this. It's not, you don't see there's very few outliers where you say, wow, well, this guy was, he might call himself a Mensa member in the case of Miles Connor, who's stolen art in Massachusetts a few times, but I don't know if he's really a Mensa. I could call myself a Mensa member, too.
Right. So the demographic is kind of, the profile is pretty narrow, it sounds like.
Again, these patterns emerge, right? And you'll always have outliers when you're looking at statistical data, but you do see this trend. And if you're from an if you're starting from ground zero in an investigation, you have to take your knowns and try to create this profile of who is most likely. For instance, and just the most obvious example, with the Gardner theft, I would be wasting my time investigating women as thieves. We know that the description was two men dressed as police officers. Now, that seems obvious, but I can't tell you how many letters and emails I've gotten over the years from people telling me, one of them was a woman, I'll bet you one of them was a woman, you know?
Dressed up like a man.
Dressed up like a man, dressed up as a police
Well, that would be
officer.
a pretty good, ploy or way to get,
In the movies, it would be a
Right, no, I
fantastic
mean, Thomas
ploy.
Crown, I mean, I've seen that.
Exactly.
I haven't read your
Right.
book, but I have seen that. But,
Right. Well, the books are going to be for sale, so you're
well, then
you're saved.
I'll have a chance. And then just the last thing is,
Sure.
you talk about the largest theft, and I was just talking to my friend. I mean, during the Nazis, the period
Right.
of the Nazis, I mean, there was all kinds, I mean,
No question.
the numbers must be astronomical.
Can't even
in
put a
terms of-
number on the Nazis.
Right.
And when I talk about property theft, I'm not talking about
You talk about
looting.
museums. Well, I'm sorry.
No, I'm talking, not just museums, but I'm talking about any type of theft, diamonds or what
Oh,
have you.
okay.
But I don't consider what the Nazis did as just theft. I mean, it transcends theft to a crime against humanity, to, it's not just some criminals who went and perpetrated a theft. I don't think that would be the correct charge.
Well,
You know,
that is
in
one
an in-
aspect, but...
Right, but in an international criminal court, I don't even think theft would be, I mean, that was an attempt to wipe out a culture.
yeah.
It's genocide.
Yeah.
And to erase their memories and history. And in the same respect, looting is different than art theft, right? So people who have brought art for years into the United States or into the West from other cultures and display it in their museums, to some people, that's theft.
Well,
You
I
know,
mean-
the Elgin marbles are the famous example about, should these be returned to Greece? There's this cutoff year, I think 1970.
Statute of limitations or something.
That's a whole different story. Don't get me
Yeah,
started
no,
on that.
I mean, you think of wars and stuff, I mean,
Yeah.
even with the wars that we've seen in our lifetime, you see people holding all kinds of art, taking them out of museums, so, anyway.
Oh, in
The
Iraq.
UNESCO, are you referring to the UNESCO
Yes.
Convention, 1970?
70?
Yeah.
Well, the looting that happened at the Baghdad Museum
Right,
in the Iraq War.
right.
I mean, that's
That's what I'm thinking.
billions of dollars.
Right.
That art is not supposed to leave the country of origin.
Right, it's like cultural patrimony.
Right, cultural patrimony. So speaking of monuments men and, the Nazis, there were a couple of examples in your book of when art was actually destroyed but that's not typical, is that
No.
correct? Could you elucidate a little bit on
Sure,
that?
it's atypical for stolen paintings, masterpieces, to be destroyed by thieves. That's the big fear, of course. The most prominent example, the one Rembrandt that was destroyed, was 1936. It was a painting of Saskia at her toilet, and it hung at the Chilham Castle in Britain, and thieves broke in the middle of the night, just around Christmas. The castle was so huge that it was populated by 3 families that were visiting, and I think 6 dogs. The thieves broke windows, went in the middle of the night, ransacked the place, took 19 paintings, and didn't wake up a single person or dog, because it was such an enormous palace. These thieves tried to sell these pieces. The police got wind of it, and as they closed in, the thieves panicked and burned the Rembrandt, which is gone forever. And I mentioned Anne Hawley, the director of the Gardner. She puts it perfectly, that when something like that happens, it's like, imagine never being able to hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony ever again. It's just gone from every iteration except your memory, and it fades over time. That's what happens when a painting is lost. Those of you who love great art know that you can buy the nicest print at the same museum of your favorite painting, and it pales in comparison. I don't care how great the digital image is. Put it up to the real one, and you say, my God, you can't compare to that real work of art by the original artist.
Well put.
I guess this is a question for Ingrid as well. You've talked, Anthony, about the fact that the art is part of our cultural patrimony and it's unique, and how that gives urgency to your career and your search for stolen art. And I'm wondering, Ingrid, with your knowledge of the materials that art is made of, does that give you a sense of urgency about his career too? Do you want these things found so that they're preserved?
Well, certainly I do. It gives me a lot of anxiety to read. Well, the book made me very anxiety-ridden. Did a lot of pacing and sweating.
Sorry.
But yes, I mean, I think I tried to mention different worrisome factors in my opening remarks, just about organic materials. Say paintings. Paintings on panels would be very sensitive to changes, in the environment. Certainly, metal bronzes, beautiful bronzes that were handled, without gloves and so forth, would be very prone to corrosion, or if they were in a high humidity area and, under someone's bed or something like that, or in a locker, or, I tried to imagine where some of the art could be. I know you make reference to some work of art that was stored in a pig farm, a hog farm.
Farm, yeah.
A lot of humidity and mud and so forth. I mean, I think that certainly ancient pieces, ancient bronzes and things would be particularly susceptible to severe degradation, could be very difficult to repair something like that and make it exhibitable again. You just have fragments, which you could have on view, but, I really... I think that in the case of when paintings are removed from frames, for instance, cut out of frames, I don't know if I suspect that a common criminal wouldn't know, to roll the painting, for instance, paint side out. They would tend to want to probably roll it paint side in. That's a natural instinct, but actually that would crack the paint more than rolling it, like with a carpet, you always roll it pile side out, for instance. So, I'm sure these don't do their homework on how to best preserve the work of art that they're about to steal. So it's very, very worrisome. I think that certain types of art are more easily repaired, and paintings, for instance, could be relined with an additional piece of canvas to strengthen them. They can be revarnished, they can be inpainted with these triple-aught, tiny brushes that have 1 and 2 hairs to kind of recreate, areas that are missing if parts are missing. But there are certain types of art, metals and ivory pieces I can think of that could be severely damaged and possibly irreparable, if not taken care of. I'd like to imagine, when I was reading your book, I kept thinking, well, maybe there's some thieves out there that are frustrated artists, and they know something about art, and maybe they are taking care of some of these pieces of art. I don't know, that's probably just being optimistic.
I wish, yeah.
But after, reading the common kind of themes that you bring up in the book, I realize that's probably a long shot.
Very. But do you see why I love Conservator so much? You see how Ingrid's mind starts working about which way you roll it. I mean, how many people think of that? Well, I hope they roll it paint side out, and you get this brush with single hair, and maybe you have to love that. If you like art, you have to love that.
There are people, the upside is there are people that could repair, given enough time and resources. Yeah.
Definitely.
Are there any cases where people have stolen art that just love the piece and they wanted it for themselves and they took it home?
There are cases like that where individuals who fall, they steal something because they love it. Again, those are the outliers, but that's allegedly the story behind the Mona Lisa theft in 1911, where Vincenzo Peruggia took the painting because he wanted to repatriate it from France to Florence. It should be in Italy. My last name's Amore, I agree with them. I'm just kidding. It should stay where it is. But yeah, there are people who have stolen art. There's a famous painting at the Dulwich Picture Gallery called The Portrait of Jacob de Gein, and it's been stolen 4 times from that one museum. And it's now called the Takeaway Rembrandt, is what it's called. And the second time it was stolen, A thief went into the museum while it was open, took it off the wall, put it on his basket on his bicycle, and just started riding away. And the museum called the police, and I love picturing this because he's still riding his bike, and the police pull up next to him. And it seems like a slapstick movie, like the bike moving slowly, and the cops just looking out the window at him like, what are you doing? And he said he was taking it home he wanted to copy it. He just wanted to do. So, in addition to the profile I've given you, you can't count out nut jobs involved in art theft too, is the outliers.